Let's get back to the final slot for today. Over the last 1.5 days of the conference, I think we have really already traveled quite an intellectual journey together, delving into various geopolitical and racial aspects, as well as authoritarian elements of the border regime. Today, we have particularly engaged with what we have outlined yesterday in our introductory speech as one of the recent re-emerging border nexuses between the border and the authoritarian transformation, whereby we discussed if we can observe a kind of a reshuffling of the relation between borders, sovereignty, democracy, and liberal state formation. But especially, I think, yesterday, we have seen the intellectual and analytical richness of studying the EU border regime from its various margins, decentering the notion of internalization as well as race, urging us to take seriously the relation in nature, the different context, as well as their historicity. On the other side, being aware of the colonial historical groundedness and depth of the processes we can observe today and the incredible power the global North and West can still exercise. Thereby, no one else has taught, at least me, to take history in a genealogical sense so serious for our contemporary understanding and conceptualization of borders and the EU border regime in particular, as William Walters did. In fact, and I think I'm not exaggerating, his very theoretical driven papers and his creative concept work have been highly influential, not only for me and my initial interdisciplinary research group called at that time Transit Migration, with whom I started this academic and activist project beginning of the 2000s in the Aden region. At that time, we even didn't really understood what we started doing, critical border studies in the German context. But since then, William Walters, with his various papers on governmentality, Europeanization, Europe's borders, the humanitarian border, or via politics, was always there as a kind of a silent conversation partner. However, it is one of his very early papers, Mapping Schengenland, that I return to again and again, and that must not be missing in any syllabus on introducing critical border studies. Here, he not only urges us to think genealogically and to denaturalize what seems to be normal border affairs or border rationals, or as I have put yesterday, as normal border nexuses, providing us with a rich time and space-bound vocabulary, conceptualizing the geopolitical, the national, and the biopolitical border, as he framed it, whereby with the war regime, it seems that the almost forgotten geopolitical border dimension is getting back onto the agenda with all its disruptive power. He also provides us with a rich methodological insight how to think, to map the border as work of many hands and brains, as an assemblage, apparatus, regime, reaching deeply into the society in its legal, moral, political, administrative, and academic structures. Insofar, when he started to conceptualize this final conference on internalizing borders, and especially as we have been sensing that we are observing since some years a kind of a serious shift, a serious reconfiguration of the border within the EU project and vis-à-vis national state policies, we had to invite William, asking him to revisit Mapping Schengenland for us. And here we are. And I don't have to tell you that we have been incredibly happy and delighted that he agreed and could make it possible to come in person and participate at this conference. So please warmly welcome again. I mean, you are already part with me. Just two, perhaps, organizational notes before I hand over the microphone. First, how we want to proceed. We ask William to give us 30 minutes keynote, but then we want directly follow after his presentation with a roundtable. And unfortunately, Anna Casalia is ill and couldn't make it, so we have a kind of a smaller roundtable with Bernd. and trying to enter again into a kind of a dialogue between William and mapping Schengenland and Bernd perception. But before I finally hand over the microphone to William, I still want shortly to introduce him to those of you who hadn't met him so far. And in fact, again, William made me the job very easy. And I cannot introduce him so nicely as he did himself at his website. So it was incredible. So I read it out. It says a lot, I think, of his academic spirit. I'm a professor of political sociology, cross-appointed in the departments of political science and sociology and anthropology. And what that means, I don't know, FPA Research Excellence Chair at Carleton. As an undergraduate, I trained in chemistry. This has been come with Bernd perhaps somehow. At Imperial College, London, before doing graduate studies in politics at City University of New York and New York University, Toronto. I have published widely in the areas of political sociology, political geography, citizenship studies, security and insecurity, and Foucault studies. My research fields have been unemployment, the supranational governance of Europe, migration, and most recently, secrecy. What links all of these areas is my interest in denaturalizing experiences and categories and interrogating the relationship to different forms of politics. I'm currently working on the projects, SAHRC-funded collaborative study of what I call air deportation, a book project with Martina Tassioli, and another book project tentatively titled Secrecy, a Critical Introduction. And I would like to end with this last sentence from his website. I quote, "If you think your research overlaps with mine and you are looking for supervision, do get in touch." So Wilma, we got in touch and hopes that our research interests overlap. And here, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sabina.
And I get in touch with you.
Thanks so much, Sabina, for that really generous introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm very grateful for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak. In 2002, I published the essay Mapping Schengenland, Denaturalizing the Border. And the paper came at the beginning of my journey into critical border studies. My interest was in part provoked by the migration controversies that were then unfolding around such troubled zones as the Eurotunnel near Calais and the border enclaves at Ceuta and Melilla. And more personally, it came at the provocation of the late political theorist Barry Hinders. And he encouraged me to shift my focus from a genealogy of Europe's common market, which was my original project, to an emergent figure, the EU's external frontiers. But there were other factors too. In 2004, I was invited to present at the Transnational Europe Conference, which was held in Rhydymnon, Crete. And it was here that I met Sabina Hess and many of her colleagues, whose transit migration network was doing ethnographies of borders and transit zones in Turkey, Greece, and Balkan regions. And for me, this was a very pivotal encounter that changed how I have approached borders. And I'll return to that shortly. I just want to say what a pleasure it is to renew this conversation exactly 20 years later. So Sabina has asked me to revisit my 2002 paper. So in what follows, I'll divide my remarks into two categories, legacies and lacunae. And I'll be much briefer on the theme of legacies because it's not my job to judge those, I don't think. And I'll say more about the lacunae, the blind spots and silences in an essay that is more than 20 years old and, like its author, showing its age. So I hope this can be a productive and generative exercise. So firstly, legacies. And so in about 2000, I was drawing inspiration from scholars like Etienne Balibar, Didier Bigot, and Saskia Sassen. And in mapping Schengenland, I made three moves that I think were in retrospect, quite original and useful to researchers. And the first was a move to relativize the connection between borders, nations, and states, and to consider emergent territories. In liberal political science, at least, the border had come to be defined by its association with the nation state, a connection which appeared axiomatic. So I think that with a nod to the historical region we find ourselves in today, you could call this the Westphalian trap. So in this light, the Schengen process seemed significant. With Schengen game, we saw a growing club of states agreeing to a relaxation of the border controls between them, coupled with and compensated by an arrangement in which each state would now police its section of the external border on behalf of all of the others. So this showed that the relationship between border controls, states, territories, and populations was not all that fixed, but in some ways variable. And this event raised the possibility of exploring other configurations and moving beyond a fixed or timeless view of borders. So I saw Schengen as an opening, a provocation to look back as much as forward, and approach this historical task in the form of a genealogy, or what I thought at the time was a genealogy. Different from other approaches, I still don't know entirely, because it detached, different from other approaches because it detached questions of borders from linear narratives and teleological processes with names like Europeanization or globalization, and treated borders and boundaries instead as singularities which demand careful empirical inquiry and sometimes conceptual invention. So I think that this open-ended, eventalized approach is well equipped to make sense of Schengen's what we could call zombie borders today, where we see a variety of internal controls reappearing, but never quite in the same form that they once had. So my second move was to sketch some elements of an analytics of borders. And here I wanted to consider different functions, logics, and time spaces that borders had taken historically. So, for example, I proposed the image of Schengen borders not as fortress walls, which was a popular metaphor at the time and still is sometimes, and for good reasons, but as filters which produce a differentiation of mobilities, circulations, and ultimately differentiations in the very value of life, which we sort of see with the way that visas work. Third, and finally, on this question of legacies, I suggested we approach borders as, like Sabina was mentioning, as assemblages of practices, thus opening a way towards a sort of decentering and materialization of the border. For example, I proposed the idea of a biopolitical border and argued it should be regarded not as a purely localized phenomenon, but rather in terms of extended networks, technologies, circulations, and experts involving matters like X-rays and medical checks, or as we see in this one, financial checks, letters of invitation, marriage and relationship tests, passports and visas, financial proofs, and much else. And each one of these elements of the biopolitical border can be a focus of a genealogy in its own right. All right, that's my brief touching on legacies. I want to now turn the rest of my attention to talking about lacunae, some of the blind spots and absences in that paper, which I can sort of see with the benefit of hindsight. And first of these is the theme of counter mapping. So I mentioned the conference in Crete where I first met Sabina and others doing ethnographies of borders. And at that conference, I was on a panel with critical geographers and architects. And I think this was because I'd written a paper called Mapping Schengenland. And so the organizers had put the mapping people together, right? So it makes sense. But the difference was that I'd only used mapping as a metaphor, whereas my co-panelists actually went out there and made maps, and I was terribly impressed with that. So one of the presentations on the panel, I want to talk about it, is by three researchers, three women from the German-based collective Anarchitektur. And when I look back at my paper now, I shudder a little bit at the title. I'd invoked mapping in a very naive way. So while I was, aware of the pivotal role that map making has played in the colonial making of the modern world, I'd nevertheless neglected to unpack what I meant by mapping. And I think this was a gap. And so what I liked with Anarchitektur is one could see, counter mapping, a particular practice that sort of was both in and against mapping. So issue 3 of Anarchitektur's journal is called The Geography of a Border, Sangatte 2002. And at the turn of the millennium, the word Sangatte had become a troubled signifier for Europe's crisis of migration and asylum. And almost nightly, there were TV images of migrants, many from Afghanistan and Iraq, who were being housed at a Red Cross facility in Sangatte near Calais. And reports told of how they would repeatedly climb into freight areas or jump onto trains or even break into the Eurotunnel on foot in a sort of bid to reach the United Kingdom. So I think it's quite telling. I mean, 20 years later, it's quite telling to sort of revisit this moment in the history of European and indeed global border crises. Because I think today, I mean, if we're looking at this particular region, media attention has shifted to a different spectacle. The crisis, the so-called crisis of the small boats, which re-inscribed this border geography. And I think Sangatte is a part of this present, because prior attempts to shut down that border route, by no means successful, but whether by Anglo-French dismantling of the Red Cross shelter or the securitization of the Eurotunnel and its feeder networks. So just as I think the securitized enclosure of civil aviation pushes people into dangerous sea or desert crossing, so did the enclosure of the Eurotunnel contribute to, precipitating this turn to the dinghy as a high-risk means of channel crossing. So impasse is also something I encountered with mapping Schengenland. I felt I had to aim for the big picture, despite my genealogical aspirations. And Anarchitektur showed another way of working. It was one that starts in the middle, immerses itself in an event, a particular site traversed by multiple discordant forces, and works outwards and inwards from that site or that locality or that conjuncture. It's the same kind of orientation towards the local, in particular, that Sabina was taking, just in a different register. This one, not ethnographic, but more in the idiom of architecture and planning. So I think it's geography of a border, not the border, not borders, and definitely not a theory of the border. So I think there are two notable features of this geography of a border that I'd like to highlight, the work that Anarchitektur did. First, it serves as a counter-aesthetic. It contrasts starkly with media coverage of Sangatte and other hotspots which present us with the polarity of what I came to call the humanitarian border. So there are no visual images of migrants here, either dehumanized or overhumanized, no manipulative affects of pity or scandal. Instead, Anarchitektur adopts the de-dramatized aesthetic of the technical drawing. But on closer inspection, and we can see this is not a matter of avoiding politics. For example, so much as looking for a different visual grammar, and I'll try it with the laser pointer. There it is. So if you see these, the little dotted lines, the broken lines, these sort of singular broken lines show the different paths the migrants are taking to various areas. So it's a very human scale, quite at odds with the migration maps we get from, say, Frontex, where migration resembles an invasion of military forces all sort of converging. The second thing I would say is that the maps anticipate what we've now come to call a material or infrastructural turn. And after all, the crisis unfolded in the techno-political niche created by the building of the Eurotunnel and the transportation network feeding it. So the Red Cross Centre itself was originally a giant hangar that was built to store these huge tunneling machines that carved out the earth. So I found this map by an architecture of the tunnel entrance especially powerful. It clarifies that a border is never just a political or juridical line. It's also entangled in material spaces and dynamic commercial transactions. You know, you can see in the illustration security cameras and floodlights around freight yards, guards and dogs patrolling perimeter fences, railway companies pressuring the French and British governments to fix the problems. And one shouldn't underestimate the role of rail companies and transportation companies in all of this. So in some countermapping, then, a powerful tool capable of exposing some of the blind spots in thinking about borders at that time, my thinking especially. Right, the second lacuna that I'd like to talk about has to do with archive. And I mentioned before that one of what I think was one of the limitations of mapping Schengenland was a kind of overreach, a misconceived urge towards the major and the macro rather than the minor. And in retrospect, I think that what I was missing was an archive. And in this section, I want to argue that we should not regard the macro and the micro as sort of separate levels, as though there's a dualism, not an either or. Instead, I think the archive offers us a site where we can see bigger processes, but on the scale or at the level of tiny details. So let me start with a point about archive, because I don't think the idea is at all self-explanatory. And then I'll offer an illustration that comes from the work that I've done in recent years on the phenomenon of air deportation. So there are many definitions of archive. It's become a critical keyword of our time. And my use is shaped very much by Foucault, as clarified in an important essay by the Norwegian scholar Knut Ove Eliassen. And Eliassen argues that for Foucault, archive can be regarded as a counter concept and a strategic term. He says that to understand it, we have to recognize that Foucault is seeking to write histories that dispense with universals like development, epoch, or evolution. Instead, he wants to trace transformation and continuity in discourses and practices in ways that are open-ended and non-teleological, ways that are attuned to the role of accident, contingency, eruption. So it's about series, events, struggles, not dialectics. And the archive is the name for any sort of collection of documents and other statements that make that kind of tracing possible. So what does an archive look like in the field of borders and migration? What kinds of knowledge does it make possible? It could take many forms. For instance, a web-based project and portal like Detained Voices could be read as an archive. It could be, and I raised this as a question yesterday, or was it today, the reports of human rights monitors who visit detention centres and other spaces of unfreedom in most EU countries. And the last time I spoke at ZIF about 7 years ago, that was sort of my archive, the reports of inspections of deportation flights, and that I was using to think about the microphysics of air deportation. But my archive today is a little bit different. Its contents were not readily or openly available in the form of a public collection. Rather, they were the product of freedom of information struggles at the intersection of public, corporate, and secretive institutions. So I have this chart. It shows all known destinations to which the UK sent deportation charter flights between 2010 and 2023. I developed an earlier version when writing an expert opinion report for a court case in the UK involving the prosecution of anti-deportation activists who had blocked a particular flight or blocked the bus that was taking people to a deportation charter flight. And in the end, the judge ruled that all of the expert opinions were not admissible, and he threw them all out, all 6 of them, because he says, well, they're not relevant to the case at hand. But the jury still acquitted the activist who did a wonderful job of defending themselves. So I developed an early version of it for the expert opinion. This version has been greatly improved by my collaboration with Travis van Isacker at the University of Bristol. So what is a charter flight? I expect most of you know. They're different from regular flights. There are no passengers, just detainees who are always outnumbered by the security guards. Now, public knowledge about deportation charters is rather patchy and uneven in the UK and elsewhere. Governments are keen to tweet out details of particular flights, boasting that they've removed, say, 37 people with no right to remain, and we've sent them to Nigeria or to Albania. But they offer little systematic information about the program. So to generate the chart, we had to use Freedom of Information data that was either posted on the open platform, whatdotheyknow.com, or make our own request. And in this way, we managed to make the UK Charter program visible, not in the form of fragmented government propaganda, but as a multi-layered visual and statistical object. So what do we learn from this archive of air deportation? I think first, we can say there are distinctive patterns and flows of expulsion which do not simply mirror the distribution of undocumented population in a given country. Put differently, deportation moves along well-defined routes. Indeed, UK officials have boasted in various hearings of their expertise in opening up particular routes to what they call difficult destinations. So we hear about migration routes all the time, like that Frontex map that I showed you. These routes are frequently mediated and visualized in alarmist and ideological ways, so that migration resembles an invasion of military forces. But here we can see that there are deportation routes as well. Second, and again, as with migration routes, we can see that these deportation routes are not fixed. They may endure over a period of years, even decades, because after once you've set up a route, you want to leverage your investment. But nothing guarantees that the route will last forever. So notice in our chart how the black lines are flights to Afghanistan in the early 2010s. Where's the laser? Yeah. There. And then we see in this period, the dark and the light greens, Nigeria and Pakistan. So you have heavy concentration of flights to those destinations. Then what's interesting, is around this sort of period, 2019, 2020, 21, we see a kind of Europeanization of these destinations. And it sort of comes to a head around the time of Brexit, when there's this sort of real push to sort of move people out before the Dublin arrangement expires. And I should emphasize, though, that these are destinations, they're not nationalities. So, a lot of these deportation flights that are going to France and Germany, they're not taking French or German citizens, obviously. They're taking a lot of people who are being expelled or deported under Dublin and then will presumably be moved on. So what we're seeing in some ways is a sort of slice or a fragment or a cut into a more global system of deportation routes and expulsion processes and flows. This is a particular cut into that. Then we see in the dying years of the Conservative regime, 2023, the deportation charter program is basically focused on Albania, one country. It's sort of turned into a pipeline, basically a flight leaving each week for Tirana. So the archive then, I'd liken it to, going back to what I was saying about the macro, seeing the macro in the micro. You know, when there's a science called dendrochronology, which is, you know, when you cut across a tree, but an ancient tree, you cut across it. There's a particular scientific method then of making those sort of the rings of the tree bear witness to history. So you can see in the rings, you know, you can see periods of drought, you can see periods of flood, you can even see apparently, you know, when there were explosions of sunspots. So, you know, this is something that the archive can do. We can see, you know, in this sense, a wider migration history that becomes visible in a particular way in these particular lines and cuts. So now go to my third and final lacuna. And I want to talk about the time of migration. When is the age of migration? What is it? It all depends, obviously. It all depends on whose migration we're talking about. So what I finished with in this last section are some posters and pamphlets mostly from the 19th century. And I offer them as a sort of visual counterpart to this final set of remarks I'd like to make about the time rather than the age of migration, although I'll come back to the idea of the age of migration in a little bit. So in her brilliant essay, Tendai Akume, who we heard from yesterday, writes, and I'll quote, the essay Migration as Decolonization, it's telling observation. So, quote, the European colonial project involved the emigration of about 62 million Europeans to colonies across the world between the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century alone. These European migrants were the original economic migrants. When they traveled out to the non-European world, they traversed it and appropriated it by relying on the same justifications First World states now use to militarize their borders against today's economic migrants, end quote. Second observation, in her book, Indian Migration and Empire, a colonial genealogy of the modern state, Radhika Mongia underscores that empire was not only this massive outward centrifugal flow of migration from metropoles to colonies, there were also vast and complex circulations of people from colony to colony, crisscrossing and connecting empires' uneven, hierarchical, and far from integrated landscape. For example, the case of British authorities fostering the migration of indentured workers from what was then Calcutta to Mauritius, starting in the 1840s, to substitute for the shrinking reserve of enslaved labour. And Mongia shows that these mobilities were what the philosopher Ian Hacking would call a niche, in which new techniques and rationalities of control were first fashioned, controls that would subsequently migrate to the metropole itself. So in other words, by writing what Gurminder Bambra has called connected sociologies, Mongia provincializes our accounts of migration control. So I offer these two observations in part because they shine light on what was a mistaken assumption I made with mapping Schengenland. And in that paper, I reproduce something that I've subsequently called the ingression bias, which could be considered in turn a particular form of Eurocentrism. This is a move that naturalizes a certain image of migration. It's an image in which migration is a powerful flow that heads towards the countries and territories of the global north, like that Frontex map that I showed you. So I think to challenge the ingression bias, we need to do the kind of work Akume and Mongia exemplify. We need to bring contemporary migrations into sustained conversation with the colonial mobilities of the past, mobilities that continue to shape our present. And this matters, I think, for several reasons. It matters ethically and politically because this kind of historical work, these counter-memories, demonstrate a long history of hierarchical and deep connection across the divisions that are today inscribed as global north and south. So as Nelson and Matsadra might say, and echoing the theme of this conference and your project, what the EU regards as external frontiers are in some ways always already internal borders. I think this kind of work, historical work, matters conceptually and epistemologically, since it settles borders of a different kind. And here I mean temporal borders, which is why I speak in this final section of the time of migration. I think that critical migration research has done a much better job of interrogating space than time, which is not to say, that there's a lot of recent work that does problematize time in particular ways, whether it's Shahram Khosravi talking about the stolen, wasted time of those who are stuck in transit, or various research that looks at the sort of production of exceptionalized time of crisis. But in other ways, I don't think we've interrogated time sufficiently. And here I'm thinking of the ways in which we implot migration. What kind of timelines do we work with? To use a term that I learned with Charles Heller and Lorenzo Pezzani when we were working for many years on our collection Via Politics. For example, what is it that allows one of the most widely used textbooks on migration, Castle, Miller, and de Hein's Age of Migration, to declare that our own time, the period beginning in the 1970s, is the age of migration? The answer they offer is that migration in recent decades is much more politicized, much more salient than in the past. I think, really? It's not that Castles et al. Are unaware of the kinds of migration that Acume, Mongier, and many other scholars of the post-colonial and the decolonial document. Indeed, in the 6th edition of the book, Age of Migration, they devote 2 chapters, I could say merely 2, since there are 15 in total, to migration before 1945. But therein lies the trick. It's a move of cordoning off, segmenting and distributing knowledge, a particular partition of the sensible, to borrow a phrase from Jacques Rancière. So I think by subsuming the colonial within a couple of historical chapters, it's as though we can proceed with the idea that the international state system and the dynamics called globalization are adequate frames. So if you look at that, the Age of Migration book, empires and colonies appear in the book only very fleetingly, never as concepts or frames. They're not erased, just consigned to a very sort of lowly peripheral place. So I'm going to sum up here, because my 30 minutes have just come up, speaking of time and age. In sum, the problem is not that the migrations of colonialism have been forgotten or completely neglected, though they have in a great deal of scholarship, so much as the way that our timelines are set up. We can do a better job, I think, with the time of migration. We can do a better job of writing migration in ways that challenge the ingression bias and many of the other ways in which colonialist amnesia, or indeed Niall Ferguson-style colonial phantasms, shape the narratives and the accounts that we produce. And I think that, at a bare minimum, is a practicable, meaningful, and worthwhile enterprise for migration researchers, and many of us are doing that already. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, William. Please keep